Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebes Publikum, ganz herzlich willkommen zum 11. Lichter Filmfest Frankfurt International. Diese Ausgabe steht unter dem Jahresthema Chaos und wir arbeiten nun endlich auch ganz offiziell gegen jede Ordnung und alte Ordnungen. Wir hinterfragen radikale Gedankenmodelle, suchen nach Chancen zu Neuanfängen und befragen Chaos als Konzept, sei es ästhetisch, sei es politisch. Dafür haben wir uns auch in diesem Jahr wieder sehr gerne mit einer neuen Ordnung verbündet. Unser ganz herzlicher Dank gilt unserem langjährigen Kooperationspartner, dem Exzellenzcluster Die Herausbildung normativer Ordnungen der Goethe-Universität. Also danke an den gesamten Cluster, besonders aber an Rebecca Schmidt und Anke Harms, mit denen wir zusammenarbeiten durften. Und danke vor allem an alle Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer unseres Begleitprogramms, ganz besonders natürlich an die 4 von heute Abend. Denn heute Abend lassen wir das Chaos regieren. Lassen wir das Chaos regieren oder regiert es einfach schon? Mich zumindest. Das Innere nach außen kehren, Verhältnisse und Erwartungen in Frage stellen, im Zwielicht vielleicht den eigenen Augen nicht trauen. Lars von Triers Antichrist aus dem Jahr 2009 spielt mit Chaos auf unterschiedlichen Ebenen, als Prinzip, als Zustand. Man könnte vielleicht auch sagen, er etabliert Chaos als das schwarze Loch der Ordnung, als etwas, das jede Ordnung verschlingt. Die 4 Teilnehmer des heutigen Abends kreisen genau um das, um die Herrschaft des Chaos in den visuellen Medien. Sie diskutieren das in ihren Vorträgen und sie diskutieren es hoffentlich im Anschluss an ihre Vorträge auch mit uns. Die Hoffnung geht also auch an Sie. Die 4 kommen aus unterschiedlichen wissenschaftlichen Disziplinen und beleuchten Chaos aus unterschiedlichen Perspektiven. Den Anfang macht Jakob Lillemose mit seinem englischsprachigen Vortrag The End is Not the End, Post-Apocalyptic Imageries in Contemporary Movies. Jacob is a curator, lecturer and writer based in Copenhagen. With numerous exhibitions to his credit, he has lately been the curator of X and Beyond, an exhibition space dedicated to presenting, investigating and engaging with contemporary disaster culture. Moreover, he holds a PhD from the Institute of Arts and Cultural Studies at Copenhagen University. After his lecture on catastrophe films, he will engage in a discussion with researcher Per Illner, a political economist and philosopher currently working in a postdoc position at the Exzellenzcluster Normative Orders. Im Anschluss, in einem zweiten Block, werden die beiden Normative Orders Mitglieder, Markus Döller, den ich leider so halb verdecke hier, und Matthias C. Kettemann, in 2 Impulsvorträgen die Frage nach der ästhetischen Dimension von Chaos vertiefen. Anschließend, wie gesagt, hoffe ich, diskutieren wir. Jetzt aber zuerst the start with Jakob and his talk about disaster.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction and thanks for the invitation to come here. I'm really happy and excited to speak in this context. Usually I work in the art context, but actually my work for the last several years, 10 years almost, has been interested or engaged with film. So I'm really happy to be here today and talk about this favorite topic of mine, disaster movies. Funny that you showed the Lars von Trier clip. We were just discussing it in the elevator because I was like, why Chaos Reigns? That's a very specific title, and of course being a Dane, I was very aware of its presence in the Lars von Trier movie. Kind of an odd little sequence in the film. I can recommend to see the film for those of you who haven't. And then as a little cliffhanger, I will end with another Lars von Trier disaster movie, but we'll get to that. Okay. I'm going to talk about disaster movies in a kind of a broad scope. And I think it's really important to notice that disaster movies span the entire history of cinema, but kind of have a prevalence in times of what I call change and uncertainty. So like other genre movies, the 70s was a big thing for disaster movies. I think you can see a really big rise in the curve of the number of disaster movies. I think then another thing when I talk about disaster movies is that the disaster depicted could either be historical or speculative. They can, like the Titanic is one historical movie. They can be speculative, like Sharknado. They can be plausible or unrealistic. They can be imminent or in the far future. So just as a way, it's kind of like trying to give an idea that disaster movies are many things and they work on many levels. I've also listed a couple of recurrent themes in disaster movies, what I call civilization off track. So like when civilization kind of loses its grip on society or mankind. Alien invasion is a classic, very popular in the 50s. The aliens can be from outer space or they can be from the ground. They can come from anywhere. Ecological chaos is pretty big. Recent movies like Geostorm, Metal Tornado, some of these things are really showing that the ecological discourse is taking place elsewhere in cultural studies, social studies, are also present in movies. And then AI takeover. This is going to be probably one of the biggest themes coming forward. I think now with the second season of Westworld coming up, I think this discussion will gain even more ground as it seems like the takeover by the robots is what is going to be the theme of the next series. Then I think it's important to notice that, or my view of disaster movies, that they feed into, they influenced and are influenced by other cultural and political imaginaries. So it's not like disaster movies are this little recreational piece of art that you go into the cinema and see and then you don't take anything out. I think they feed into a really large political and cultural discourse, and that connection is something I think me and Per will go further into when we engage in the discussion afterwards. They reflect mythologies, agendas, and philosophy. So there's like, you can really dig deep into disaster movies. I mean, some of them can be, of course, watched very superficially on your couch on a Sunday afternoon with a hangover. But I think if you really go into it, as I have done, they really, not that I've had hangovers every Sunday, but really they contain much more than their reputation really gives them. And that's also the claim I want to make today. It's a genre that's really worth engaging with. And then the general question here is really like, how do we imagine the end? This is kind of the famous, the central question of this engagement with disaster movies, and that's kind of why I wanted to build this talk as the end is not the end. Before I go on, let me say a little bit about my background of coming into this, why I'm talking about disasters in this context. As it was mentioned in the introduction, I ran, or still running, but now in a nomadic form, an exhibition space called X and Beyond in Copenhagen. It was a practice-based postdoc at the University of Copenhagen, involved in a research project called Changing Disasters, which was part of a larger university entity called Copenhagen Center for Disaster Research, where you could get a Master of Disaster. Well, it's called Master of Disaster Management, actually, but the joke is it's called Master of Disaster. But was kind of more hands-on engagement with disasters. And the research focus on of the group that I was involved in and that Per was also involved in, where we met, was how disasters shape society and how society shapes disasters. So this kind of double view on disasters. And I think that could also, that's also something I want to focus on in my look at the films as we go on. X and Beyond had a very specific focus because the research center was interdisciplinary. It involved lawmakers, economists, anthropologists, literary scholars, epidemiologists, so kind of a transdisciplinary research project. And my specific focus with X and Beyond was how art and popular culture engages with the complexity of disasters. So really bringing all this rich material that is in disaster art, I guess you could say, and bringing that to the fore. I guess, I mean, luckily we all have most experience with disasters through fiction. And I think that is also important in the sense that through our engagement with fiction, we have experienced disasters and made a lot of thoughts about it. But on the other hand, I think it also says something about the need to reflect on disasters. And that's why I think working in a context like I did in the research center is where people were also working on very hands-on solutions to disaster problems. I had to find a reason for, or a justification for working with art. And I think the justification is that mankind has worked with disaster for thousands of years. And that must say something, that there's a need to reflect on the more intangible aspects maybe of disasters, what I call the deep complexity of disasters. It's a really advanced and sophisticated language. So here's a little image of one of the exhibitions that I made. I mean, I was involved with film on many accounts. I curated programs at the Film House in Copenhagen. I had several screenings, talks, panels involving film. But I also did this exhibition called Society C, just move over here, which was what I call a research installation. It consisted of 7 of these boards with different material related to zombie fiction. And I guess zombie fiction is, you could say, it's our contemporary apocalypse. If you ask a person, random person on the street, it's pretty likely that they would say our contemporary disaster is the zombie apocalypse. I mean, I don't know if in here, I mean, maybe I'm making a bold claim, but I think it resonates a lot with people. I mean, this was also a time when The Walking Dead was really popular on Netflix and so on. But what I did here was not really look at the zombie genre as such, but more look at the zombie apocalypse as a way to, how do you say, look at society. What does the zombie society say about, or the zombie apocalypse say about human society? So in the show there was not really a lot of zombies. It was more about like how do society react to this state of exception when people are, or well, the living dead are walking the streets and want to eat your flesh. It's a challenge, to say the least, and zombie fiction comes up with many different solutions. Some are kind of a return to medieval times. Some are like an accelerated capitalism. I mean, there's so many ideas of what do people do when you have a disaster that will not end. And I think that's what's interesting about the zombie apocalypse. It doesn't end, it just continues. I mean, you can kill 1,000 zombies, there will be another 1,000 and another 1,000. And I think that's why a series like The Walking Dead is like, it's gonna continue for I don't know how many seasons. And that's a particular kind of disaster, I think, which is also interesting for me in this context. Yes, I'll skip to the next here. Back to disaster movies. Oops, those. I'm gonna talk about 2 movies here, in this idea of the end is not the end. 2 movies which I think shows 2 significant kind of endings in disaster movies. One is The Road, a novel by Cormac McCarthy, and filmed in 2009 with Viggo Mortensen in the main role. Maybe you're familiar with the story, but just so everyone is familiar with the story, a father and his son walks through a post-apocalyptic landscape covered in grey ashes. And there's some kind of, there's been some kind of disaster. It's not really clear what it is, but they're searching for somewhere to live on. It's basically a very brutal world that they walk through. But in the end of the film, the father dies, and then what happens next is what I want to show you. The next film, which has a very different ending, is called Take Shelter. I don't know how many of you know this film, but if you haven't seen it, it was kind of a bummer that I show you the ending. But that's a kind of spoiler alert risk you run with doing a talk like this. It's a story about a man who starts having these visions of something, an imminent disaster, but no one believes him. But he is taken up by these visions, and he starts building a shelter to protect him and his family from the disaster that he thinks comes. Then you go through a lot of social kind of problems connected to this building of the shelter, and he's deemed crazy. He loses it. Society excludes him. The visions are not real. And then you come to the end. So I want to show you these two endings, or parts of it at least. Okay. So, looking at these two films, I kind of came up with the idea to make this proposal to think about two kinds of endings. As to say that there's basically two general kinds of endings in disaster movies, each with their own existential and political perspectives. One is the reactionary ending, and the other is what I call the critical ending. The reactionary ending would be The Road. And why that? Because it has a happy ending. Well, it does, of course. The boy finds comfort, but at the same time what happens is also that he's reintegrated into a social structure that existed also before, the nuclear family. It's a kind of a return to something from before. Whereas Take Shelter, which would be the critical ending, opens with a questioning of who is really the insane people. Why? What is the disaster, but also who do we listen to in face of contemporary disaster scenarios? Who has the perception, who has the reason to perceive what is going to happen next? Is it a madman, or is it the so-called experts? And I think in that way the two endings, one ends by a closure, the other ends with an opening. I think that's the kind of duality that I want to get at. But let me get into just a little bit more about each of the two. In the reactionary ending, disasters are a crisis to be overcome. So it's not like it's a problem to be fixed, so to speak. It could be ended. And it ends by a return to an order that existed before the disaster hit. And you can kind of get back to it in a way like it never happened. So therefore there's no no reason to question the order that existed. And often you have this order embodied by a hero, either in the shape of a single figure or a group, which is kind of a classic trope in myths, that you have this hero that guides us through challenging times. The classic example that everyone probably knows is Armageddon, with Bruce Willis, who gets in a spaceship and destroys the meteorite that is on the way towards Earth. But moreover, and I think this is something I want to talk with Per about also, in these movies the disaster becomes an occasion to prove the power, necessity and justification of that order and its embedded cultural, social and political values and structures. So you stage disaster in a way to prove your own worth. I think this can be applied also to contemporary politics, real life politics. And it shows that civilization as we know it will prevail. There's no reason to question civilization as such. Civilization is not the problem. It's the crisis that needs to be overcome. And actually, civilization proves its worth by overcoming this crisis. So then there's the critical ending. And in these types of movies, disasters marks a period of transition or rite of passage or emerging of something new. It's an occasion for change in the existing order of things and the emergence of new possibilities, phenomena, and ideas. And in this way, the disaster can be seen as a critique of the existing order and shows that it's not given and it's not invulnerable. I think that's also that civilization is not without its flaws. The disaster, as we saw in Take Shelter, represents an open horizon for really imagining the values, social, cultural, and political values of society, for better and worse. Sometimes it can also go for the worse, but it has this idea of empowering strangers, those that did not have any reason before, those that were excluded by society, somehow is empowered, either politically or philosophically. And the end becomes a new vision, vision for a new beginning. And I think this idea of thinking about an ending as the emergence of something new, the beginning of something new, is really what I want to get to. And I've mentioned a few of them here, a little bit more obscure maybe than the ones I mentioned before, but I can highly recommend all these. Phase 4, for those, it's a film festival, so we can get a little film nerdy here. Phase 4 is basically about ants taking over mankind with a scheme. The ants from outer space really outsmart humankind and take over Earth in a really epic showdown. And I'm not saying this ironically, it's one of the most mind-boggling film about existence on planet Earth. So basically what I'm saying here is that although we conceive of disasters as a kind of an ending, I would say we should talk about the non-ending ending. And really, recognize the complexity of the genre. I mean, some of it is deeply suspect. I would say The Walking Dead is a deeply suspect genre of TV series that basically advocates the killing of whatever is a problem to the highly visionary as Phase 4. So in that way, it works both ways. It can be a tool for both reactionary and critical thinking. Through what I call these endgame aesthetic, disaster movies offer a rich and fascinating engagement with the troubling times we live in, with the fears and the hope of our contemporary existence and its projected future. I think this is really what the genre holds for us, what it can do. But again, then I think there's a basically problem with accepting the end or the finality, and I think that's why we're really obsessed with imagining what comes after the end. So when we watch these films, it's really what comes after the end that's crucial. It's not how things end, it's what comes after, because there's something after, or at least most of the time. I want to end by showing you two types of endings that gets close to being a real end. But yeah, we can discuss that. The first is what I call the post-human end. And this is where, as I said also with Phase 4, where mankind is no longer on Earth. These are two films. One you probably know is The Birds by Alfred Hitchcock. The other is Kingdom of the Spiders by John Cardos. Maybe not so familiar. What's interesting is both these films have endings that were never included in the official release. And the ending that was never included in The Birds is a shot of the birds completely covering the Golden Gate Bridge, indicating that the birds are not just a problem for this little bay, it's for the entire country. More radically, Kingdom of the Spiders, the end scene here shows the little valley where the film takes place being completely covered in spiderweb. But there is actually it's in a German version, curiously enough, that shows the entire Earth being covered by spiderweb. So kind of scaling it up. These kind of movies, I think, are really engaging with this, what is our role on this planet, and it reverses this man versus nature, the power relation, which is the basis of civilization. And in that way can be seen as this critique of modernity. Can we live in this world without human control? I think this is something that I think we should start reconsidering. How do we live in a world that we cannot control? We somehow living in this, coping with a permanent state of exception. I think that those movies really feed into this contemporary discourse. I mean, now the complexity of the disaster scenarios of today, I think movies like this really offer something to reflect upon. But then I'll end with, as promised, the real ending, the ending of all endings, maybe the post-Earth ending. Melancholia, Lars von Trier's disaster movie, which tells the story of the approaching planet Melancholia that will eventually destroy Earth, and a little group of people's ways of dealing with this wipeout scenario. There's the typical in Lars von Trier fashion, the science man who decides to be a coward and commit suicide. And then at the end, we're left with 3 people, at least in the scenario we are following. 2 sisters, one, the wife of the father who killed himself, bourgeois, upper class, and her sister, who is kind of crazy, or deemed crazy, at least in a way, deemed somehow awkward, not socially unfit in a way, and then the other sister's kid. And so those 3 stand on the terrace at the end of the film, and they ask, so what should we do? Now it's like 1 hour before the impact. What do we do? And the bourgeois sister says, oh, let's open the most expensive bottle of red wine and listen to classical music. And I mean, immediately when I saw it, I was like, really? But maybe, yeah, okay, that's one way to do it at least. But then the other sister comes up with what ends being the solution, which is that all 3 of them build this little intimistic hut of branches, and then they sit under this hut. Of course, they are not protected. They reach into a spiritual realm to come and cope with this what is coming. But through this spirituality, they find something that a glass of red wine could not. I mean, it's a more. I mean, it's an undefined cultural code that they reach out for, because what is coming is something new. I mean, red wine doesn't have any significance facing melancholia. There's something, we have to come up with something new, and they do, and they reach outside reason in a way. They're not trying to save themselves, but they are trying to meet this ultimate destruction in a spiritually adequate way. So with that, I mean, I could show the ending, but I think I've taken enough time. So I'd rather engage now with Per. You probably know the ending. It's amazingly beautiful and powerful. So if nothing else, a recommendation to go see the film over the weekend. But I think that's what I had to say, Per, and then the 2 of us can engage in a discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Jacob, first of all, for coming to Frankfurt and for giving us this introduction into your research into disaster movies. I'm really happy in particular that Jacob is here because he's a dear colleague of mine from the Copenhagen Center for Disaster Research, where I also was engaged before coming to Frankfurt. And so it's always nice in a way to bring colleagues together and make people connect and meet and so on. In particular, if you have worked at various interdisciplinary research centers, where I think there's always, and that's true for Copenhagen as well as for Frankfurt, a kind of particular vibe of intellectual exchange and camaraderie. So thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
I was interested in, obviously, in your bifurcation of endings, right? To disaster, and 2 different ways of coping with disaster. And first of all, what I appreciate generally about your work, and have for all this time that we've worked together, is the way that the space you grant, and that was clear from your talk as well, to the role of culture as something which has an active role in shaping the way that humans deal with politics, policy changes, particularly around this role of disaster or threat, right? So I think part of our experience that we had together working in Copenhagen at a place which was in a way, I guess, where we encountered people that worked very immediately with disasters and catastrophes, so disaster managers, that, as you said, had an extremely concrete take on what to do with social threats. And the two of us, I guess, working from a kind of more culturally informed perspective, had to find, as you said, a way to make a strong claim for the relevance of culture in, you could say, politics and policy and questions which are normally treated in the realms of kind of social science and policy making, right, such as disaster management. And so I think that what I think you made a strong claim for in your talk just now is the role that culture plays in anticipating, on speculating, prefiguring questions of social cohesion, social conflict, in the face of, you know, a kind of unnamed danger, you could say, which structure, or you could say overdetermine even questions of immediate policymaking. And I think that's the wager that we always had for people that worked in disaster policy, was to say that people, you know, working with fiction, for instance, have addressed these questions for, you know, millennia.
Yeah.
So I think, and I'm grateful for your input about this because I think it's a very strong point to make. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about, you mentioned at the beginning that disaster films or disaster fiction generally is particularly prevalent in periods of uncertainty and change. I was wondering if you had looked, if we perhaps focus on 20th century post-war disaster movies,
yeah.
What are the most prevalent dangers that are imagined in these works of fiction? Have you tried a kind of taxonomy of these and how this comes to play?
I have not to any degree that I would speak about it here, but I can say one thing is the first so-called wave of disaster movies in the 50s, which deals very much with post-nuclear threat. Like the nuclear threat is not the nuclear war as such, but that mankind has produced this pollutant, which is nuclear power, and that nuclear waste can have destructive or transformative effects on the environment. That was a kind of general threat, or like a fear, because it was out of human control. If there was a nuclear disaster, then people would basically not be able to stop it. I mean, it would just go on by itself. So that was reflected in a number of movies that dealt with where nature would mutate. Giant ants would come out of the desert in New Mexico, which was where there's a movie called Them, which basically takes place right where the U.S. tested the first nuclear bomb in New Mexico desert. And these ants have been growing underground due to the effects of nuclear energy or the nuclear blast, and then 10 years later they re-emerge and threat humankind. But of course humankind is able to defeat these beasts or monsters, and that's kind of the story of a lot of disaster movies of the 50s. Is there is a hero, mankind is still the strongest. The second wave, which I think is the one that's more interesting in this context, because it's a much more open and much more critical wave, is in the 70s, which is basically social unrest on many accounts. There's the post-Vietnam trauma, there's pollution on a completely different scale, much closer to where people live. There's this kind of really accelerated new consumer culture that also influences people. So there's one movie that is kind of interesting in that context, just to give you some images of what's happening, and I'll stay within this animal theme because that's something I work specifically with. A movie called The Squirm, where this high-wired electricity that feeds a city falls down, and the electricity that feeds the city suddenly feeds some worms in the ground, and these worms end up taking over society. So this is kind of like where what we thought was our strength shows its flaws and turns around on mankind. So I think that would be a theme of the 70s, and then of course the 90s. You have this return of the hero in facing the big disasters, and of course that's a very typical Hollywood movie and ending. And I think that's really, I think when most people identify with contemporary disaster movies, is this hero figure that is able to help on behalf of mankind to overcome the threat. And this is like taken to absurdities in the series of Sharknado movies, where there's like people are trying to save the world from nuclear sharks coming out of the sky. I mean, it's super crazy imagination, but it's still with a man with a chainsaw that saves the world. So these kind of I think that those are some very, very general aspects. But I think definitely if you want to look at for critical endings, I would go to the 70s and definitely then reactionary endings on either side.
That's interesting, because it's almost as if, I mean, first of all, it's interesting that it's not a linear or progressive path, right? It's not like, it doesn't seem like, judging from the history of disaster movies, that you have something like a kind of history of enlightenment that takes place where people gradually realize that the threat that they imagined to be external, right? In the Cold War, for instance, the threat that they imagined to be the Russians or whatever, actually is an imminent threat of, let's say, ecological collapse, which has to then accordingly be tackled kind of together and collectively. But that it's rather kind of back and forth, right, between realizations of, let's say, the becoming imminent of threat to society, right, which would then enable a kind of critical reading, right? Yeah. Because if there's no outside to the production, the social production of danger, then obviously there's no one you can blame on. That would take the blame, right? And it's interesting how that oscillates with reactionary readings, where order is reestablished, right? I guess predominantly by a kind of male hero figure.
Yeah. There's another version of that, which would be Titanic, which is it's a disaster of civilization, but in the movie it's turned into a love story. So it's really not about the ship going down. It's about two people being separated. I think that's also a way of rewriting history from a post-political point of view.
Rather than it being about, for instance, a technological disaster, right? Which,
yeah,
I think
that's just a backdrop for heroism.
Yeah,
in the film.
Yeah, so it's rather than I think the Italian autonomous Marxist Amadeo Bordiga once said, the invention of the ship is the invention of the shipwreck. Right. So rather than reading Titanic in this way, it's rather reframed as a kind of love story between two people that can then get separated.
Yeah. Right.
Though Leo is great in it, of course. Okay.
Yeah, he's always great.
I mean, I guess I was reminded, but that's just a kind of... I wonder, because it's interesting to me that particularly in relation to zombie films, the solutions that are imagined in zombie fiction around the zombie apocalypse or takeover are super varied. You mentioned that with zombie films there's this kind of complete wave of possible solutions that society comes up with to defend itself against this threat. So it's almost as if at a certain level the threat becomes completely structural or immaterial or almost void, right? Where you cannot even, or the threat just becomes a kind of variable, X.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different kinds of zombie fiction, but the ones that I was particularly interested in was the work by George Romero, the American movie director who directed Night of the Living Dead and then made 5 other movies about this. What's really interesting about Romero is that the reason the zombie apocalypse or the zombie state of exception continues is because mankind keeps reproducing the same structures over and over again. And in the last film he made, called Survival of the Dead, mankind actually manages to teach the zombies to eat horse meat, which would be an end to the state of exception. But what happens with the great irony in the film is that mankind doesn't find out that they actually succeeded, because the experiment is taking place in a farmhouse a little bit away, and there's a stupid intrigue about money, and the only survivor of this intrigue decides to take the money and escape with it instead of going back to see that the experiment that they have been working on for years has actually succeeded. How about that, right? Pretty ironic, but I think that's an irony that I mean, it's also there in the first movie, in Night of the Living Dead, when the house that you follow in the movie, there's one survivor, a black character, and when he tries to, when the rescue team comes, they just see him as another zombie, and instead of having a survivor, they shoot him down on prejudice. So these are the kind of mechanisms of social prejudice and social reproduction that is at stake in many of the zombie fictions, in particular, which are delivered with in Romero's case, with a sharp critical critique.
But I wonder, I mean, I guess it's fairly easy to pick apart the reactionary ending, right? Like,
why? Yeah, okay, yeah, it is.
So, I mean, to critically pick it apart. So, I had actually the same, I hadn't seen The Road before, but I had this, I was actually fairly, so when the father dies, right? I was very actually touched by that, and I thought, oh, well, this is actually an emancipatory reading, I thought, because after all, there's a kind of generational, inevitable generational sequence, right? Yeah. The father dies, the son has to live on by himself alone.
Yes.
He cannot pretend to be a child anymore. He will have to grow up and face the world alone, and all of which are not particularly reactionary in themselves, right? And then comes this like unsympathetic guy and like adopts him.
Well, maybe he's good. He's a good guy. Maybe, I don't know. It's very.
But the fact that he gets adopted is what makes for the reactionary ending.
Yes, that was my argument.
Exactly, and so I was super disappointed because at first I thought it was a critical ending.
Well, then you should read the version of the book that I edited, where we basically bought 10 copies of the book, cut out the ending from where the father dies, and handed them out at an art fair. So you can read it without that ending.
So you changed the end. You changed the.
We changed the ending. Yes.
Yes. But I wonder in the critical endings, I guess there are also, you insisted on openness for that ending, which I find interesting because you could think of countless, and I guess the kind of like cheap ecological activism that we have today on the part of like Tesla and Google, for instance, or what, like Silicon Valley ecology stuff. Of course, literally thinks that we can engineer our way out of ecological crisis.
Yeah.
Pretending to be a critical ending, right? There is a critical ending. The critical ending is we embrace that the threat is imminent. There is no external threat. Society has imminently produced ecological collapse. However, we have Elon Musk, and so we will survive. I mean, I guess that's also the return of the hero in a way.
Yeah, I would.
But I'm wondering about the potential of reactionary critical endings, where there would be, where there would be a kind of like facile utopia, which would take over. And I grant you entirely that obviously Melancholia is not that at all.
No.
But I was wondering, because it seems to me that actually today we're full of what is often sold to us in terms of fiction, but also corporate narratives, is precisely a kind of like ethical savior narrative around I don't know, a kind of like idea that we are all in this together. It's not the Cold War type, the good against evil thing. Mm-hmm. It's like more this idea that we're all in this together. We have somehow produced ecological catastrophe. However, we also have the means to engineer ourselves out of this, which seems to me to be like a really prevalent cultural narrative today.
I'm just thinking about if I can come up with movies that has this theme.
Okay, right, yeah.
But I think, yeah, I mean, if it's a big issue, is engineering the issue, is engineering the solution, or you could ask, is civilization the problem?
Right.
Because I think that's what for me the problem with the engineering solution is, it doesn't question our way of living. It just says, hey, we can fix it. We can filter the air, but you can just still keep on driving cars and pollute the oceans. I think that's the danger in the engineering solution. You had a question?
Yes, I have even a question to this direction, because I think in the examples you show, is it not always like this, that even if they have a reactionary ending, that they are deeply interwoven with critical elements? So like in the road, you have on the surface, you have a change, because you have something new, so you have a different person who reiterates the position of the father, and then reiterates the normative structure for the reproduction. And you have this even in Titanic, what Slavoj Žižek calls the Cameron's Hollywood Marxism, because on the surface it seems so that the poor boy from the working class falls in love with the upper class woman, and then there is a dissolution actually of the class. But at the very end, so we see that it is not. But the film tries to say it could be possible that there is a dissolution of the differences, and this I think makes it even more reactionary, because on the surface it seems so it has a critical gesture. But in fact, it reiterates or reproduces this.
Right. No, I'm glad you mentioned it, because it made me. I think you're completely right. But it made me think about another kind of strand in disaster movies, which I would call the political correct disaster movies, and those were also pretty prevalent in the 90s, and they were where the disaster was something outside of human society. It was an occasion for human society to come together. Divorced couples in Twister, they find each other under a bridge seeking shelter from the tornado, and stuff like this. Races are also, but of course, as you say, if you dig deeper into it, it's really not this vision of a multicultural society all the way. But that's interesting. But it's basically, I think what would be interesting for me in these movies is that the disaster is post-political, and it cancels out the question of politics. Yeah.
I was actually wondering, before reminding you of the time.
Right.
But I was wondering if, thinking from the different political spectrum, so to say, if looking at films not from the Western Hemisphere, but maybe from the eastern parts of Europe, or not anymore Europe, I was concretely thinking about, I think it's called Letters from a Dead Man in English. It's a film from the 80s by a Russian director called Kolesnikov, I think, if I recall correctly. And it is a very dark, nearly tinted aesthetic, so it's more yellowish than anything else, and the story is some post-apocalypse with a few survivors hiding themselves in the cellar or basement of a museum. That makes for the starting point, and it's people working in the museum. It's a natural history museum dealing with the history of mankind in a way, and they are very intensely reflecting upon the history of mankind, and in their situation, the future of mankind. There is some sort of shelter somewhere outside, and people have contact with other sheltered people climbing through this yellowish landscape in very thick clothes to protect themselves. But this shelter is available or admissible only for people who are very young and very strong. So there is some sort of a scenario of a society that maybe will prevail, but it's pretty sure that the people sitting in this particular museum cellar won't survive. And what they actually do is, the one guy is writing letters to his son, who is probably dead as well. So that is a very dark, gloomy situation of leaving some testimony of a culture that's on the verge of being erased. And I wondered actually, starting from this thought, about the relation between disaster and chaos. I mean, the one more or less being the ending, was the other one is more the beginning or the pre-constituency of a situation. And if that is something we totally we can't imagine, because we always think along our thinking lines, and we are used to having control.
Yeah.
And whenever we lose control, and then we just stop thinking and try to find one of any ending that we can imagine. This one, to me, seemed an example for something that's not really having an ending. Okay, that was a very long question. Not.
Yeah, well, I mean, I completely agree that you can make this distinction between disasters and chaos in some way. Right now, I'm working at the Medical Museum in Copenhagen as a curator, and we're working with contemporary biologists. And I think the trend in contemporary biology also now is that we are realizing that there's so much we don't understand. It's just chaos out there, how things are connected. And I think this is a new paradigm coming within the natural sciences. How do we cope with living in a world where we cannot explain things that are happening? The complexity of influence in the world we're living in today is so intense and so deep that we lack models, language and knowledge to explain it. And I think this is really a challenge to our still modern way of conceiving ourselves as being not only in control but also in the know of how nature works, because there's simply too many things where we go like, what caused that? Epigenetics, for instance, bacteria, all these things, like what are these things? And this is I mean, we had the excellent scholar Myra Hurd at the museum the other day, and she's working particularly with the oceans and how pollution influences the oceans. And she just basically said it's just chaos out there. And then how do we think with chaos now in this sense? I think on a really material level, I think your question feeds right into that, and that's the new disaster. And I think that was something we struggled with at the Disaster Institute. Was climate change a disaster? And a lot of people say no, it's not, because it's not. It doesn't have this event character in the same way. It's a long, complex, slow process.
And it begs the question also of causality, right? Because if it's not monocausal, so
exactly.
If, for instance, climate change, and I guess the Anthropocene is a term that a lot of people then use to kind of come to terms with multi-causal effect structures in climate change, for instance. What's interesting is that it seems that a number of, I mean, this would be a very schematic, so maybe I can, maybe we should wrap it up afterwards, but to counter your schematic of two different endings, maybe I could counter this by my own kind of schematic split between, on the one hand, there would be a response to disaster which is motivated by fear, right? And that would be, then you can only have a reactionary response if you're afraid. But then there's also a clearly identifiable antagonist, right? That it then can be countered by like a strong hero figure or whatever. And then you could also respond not with fear but with anxiety, right? So in the way that someone who's always quoted in film theory, but I'm just going to do the same now, Jacques Lacan in a seminar, distinguishes fear from anxiety, and he says that fear is something that has a clearly identified cause. Anxiety is a structural effect of a wider system. And I guess the ethical injunction would be, and also for filmmaking perhaps, would be how can we respond with anxiety rather than fear? And what would that mean for the construction of endings?
Right. Yeah, because I think the question is right or relevant in the sense that I mean, if you use another, I mean, Kierkegaard also had this distinction earlier on, and I think it is anxiety. It's because we don't really know what climate change, how it will affect social relations, our ways of living. We don't know. We have fiction to imagine it, and I think that's why fiction is so relevant. There's people who have imagined what would it be if you read The Drowned World by J.D. Ballard, 1962 novel. It's about a drowned world. What does it mean to live in a drowned world? How does that reconfigure social relations? How does it reconfigure psychology, even? I think this is why we need to. I think why it's so important to reach or go to fiction right now, because there's so many unknowns involved in the disaster scenarios that could be imminent.